sort of represents the halfway mark. It feels like a halfway mark. I think it's a lot more work than that. I've certainly finished field work at this point. And it was an ambitious task from the outset to assess what invertebrates and fish populations are where and how we can describe and characterize their communities based on environmental characteristics in False Bay using underwater camera technology. So I think there are some faces in the audience who are familiar with me for the project that kind of gave rise to where my PhD evolved out of, the PhD being the most sort of recent development. But some years ago, my colleagues and I looked to testing and developing underwater camera systems to sort of address some of the shortfalls in subtidal fish population monitoring around the coastline. And I'm not going to go into the details of that today, but essentially to look at repeatability, cost efficacy, and transparency around monitoring techniques. For those of you who come from further afield than the Western Cape, which I think is most of the audience today, I work in False Bay, which lies directly south of Cape Town, and it's South Africa's largest bay, apparently, and it runs to about 90 meters at its mouth. So that lies between Cape Point in the west and Cape Hunklip in the east. And it's a really interesting site to look at in terms of biodiversity because it sits between the sort of confluence of our major oceanographic regimes, the Agulhas in the east and the Benguela in the west. And what that means is that we find species that are typical of both the warmer southern Cape Coast and the cooler west coast, and they're represented in the bay. But I actually had to think about the relevance of this talk in light of what the theme of this conference was, and that's about biodiversity economy. And biodiversity in and of itself is fascinating in False Bay, but it's how this biodiversity pertains to human use that is really what brought this research into play. And False Bay has a long history of human use, hundreds, if not thousands of years of humans in the area. And certainly commercial records dating back at least 400 years of fishing in the region. And that has huge implications, of course. And it's lain in trying to get a handle on the context here. So there's some very varied and diverse stakeholders and users of the bay. There's some key participants. Here you see the line fishery. This is traditional handline fishermen on their chakis, the wooden boats that leave from Kalk Bay Harbour. And these are people who feel the impact of fluctuations in fish populations and changes in management strategies at the coalface. They're directly dependent on the fish resources in False Bay and off Cape Point. They can't tow their boats like ski boats around the coast to look for fish. They're limited to where they can leave from the harbour. There are a lot of recreational users of False Bay. It's a popular tourism destination. It's also a major urban centre. And one of these players being the spearfishing sector, which has major implications for the reef fish in the region if you look at sport fishing and a sort of trophy approach to long-lived, slow-growing species. But what really fascinates me is how much the population is growing. These are shore anglers in and around False Bay. And there's a whole section in the northern reaches of False Bay that's kind of been ignored in terms of contribution, planning, and impacts. That being the populations that make up Mitchell's Plain, Khayelitsha, which has sort of certainly been ignored in the urban planning sector, but will have a major impact in the region in time to come. And so this has been about understanding context, particularly for a region where you come in with novel techniques to do a baseline survey in a highly impacted system and making sense of this shifted baseline, essentially. So to quickly fill you in on the highlights of the research process to date, the first step was really beyond getting a handle on what the habitats looked like, figuring out where the things without backbones were, and in what numbers and how those communities change over the sea floor. And that has involved this contraption, which we built to do a survey on Walter's Shoal, which is where it was sort of piloted, but it actually came to me in False Bay to kind of run it for the first time. In the housing over there, there's a GoPro facing the sea floor, and it takes photographs at intervals. We lower it by means of that winch to the sea floor, take some photographs, we winch it back up, we move 1 nautical mile on, drop it, photos up, and we continue that for the rest of the day along a transect. So that's pretty much how it works. Being a visual method of data collection, there are limitations and challenges. As you can see from the picture, False Bay seemed to get the signal from Poseidon when I signed the document starting my PhD that it was now time to throw El Nino, repeated red tides and plankton blooms, upwelling, whatever else it could throw at me. We've had that kind of water for nearly a year. But I think working at the interface where visual methods become really tricky, where visibility is limiting, is a good place to test this, because you are guaranteed that where things have better visibility, it possibly works better. And so this is sort of preliminarily allowing me to assess populations across both reef and sand. Historically, there's been grab samples taken in the 1960s in False Bay, the infauna across the sandy habitats, but not much done on the subtidal reefs. And that's really important because those reefs fall within the Table Mountain National Park. So this standardization is what I'm interested in when it comes to the cameras when we assess fish. And this is a BRUV, or a baited remote underwater video system. And it works by lowering it to the sea floor. There's a canister filled with tasty sardines there, and it films for an hour on the sea floor all the life that swims into the frame towards that bait canister. And to date, I've managed to track down 19 species of sharks, rays, and skates. There's about 37 species of chondrichthyans on record in the bay. So this is approaching a nice kind of survey technique. And then I've just noted there that the puff-adder shy shark, which belongs to the family Silurinidae, was found everywhere and in large numbers. And that's kind of triggered a genetic study into, is this the puff-adder shy shark? Is it a dark shy shark? Is there a continuum? What shark is what? Habitat and season were important predictors, and this interaction between depth and season. But I'm not going to go into this. There's a paper on it, and there's a point, I think, which might be of more value to this audience than the results that I want to make at the end. 38 species of teleosts so far, and the sparrows, the stereo-BRUVs, being endemic to the region, really appearing as the dominant species group on the cameras. And that's important because a lot of these species are resident on those reefs. They're slow to mature, they're slow to grow, they change sex at some point in their lives, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable to the effects of overfishing. Habitat being the key predictor in those systems. But I wanted to bring us back to that word that I flagged at the beginning, which was context, when I spoke about shifting baselines and working in a system that is highly impacted. And I thought about who the audience would be at a conference like this, and I thought about it being conservation practice. And I think of more value at this point is my lessons that I've learned around understanding context and communicating that to engage an audience to whom these results are ultimately going to matter down the line. So I heard a quote a little while ago, and I can't remember who to attribute it to. It was some business person, and they said, in an age of information overload, people don't want more information, they want a story to which they can relate. And I found that kind of troubling as a scientist, because I'm all about information and generation of knowledge, and we want people to take that up. But it's been key in driving my approach to this research. This is what False Bay looks like now. It's not the False Bay of 400 or even 100 or even 50 years ago. It's busy. There are hundreds of eyes on the water. There are lots of engaged, committed citizens who are really interested in what happens with the future of False Bay's biodiversity, which is a great thing, but it's a challenging thing and a challenging system in which to work. So if I thought I could go into this system anonymously and start a purely academic project and get away with publishing results in a scientific paper 5 years down the line, I was being very naive. And I think I've learned two things. One, that communicating to the public from the outset mattered in this context because their buy-in mattered to get the project going. And number two, that ultimately, when I generate the information, having communicated to the public and having them trust the source of my research helps in the uptake of the information I want to ultimately affect management in the region. To illustrate the first point, I have a little story to relate about when I started out in False Bay. I was a very young, naive scientist. There was a program called OSearch, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, that had sort of been doing tagging of great white sharks around the coast. They came into False Bay, home of the great white shark, it's what we're known for. They were doing a research project there, tagging great white sharks, which obviously involves chumming to attract sharks to the vessel, standard protocol. And project happened, off they moved, and sometime later there was a fatal incident with a surfer and a great white shark. Now, it doesn't matter what the facts were surrounding that. It doesn't matter if there are dots to be connected or not. It doesn't matter what we consider to be a reasonable assessment of that story. What mattered was how the public took that story, how it caught their imagination, and what they did with it. So there I was, a student about to set out with 260 cameras to deploy around False Bay, basically with a bucket of chum attached to the front of the camera face, and scientists were the least popular people in that region. And I had a vision, together with my supervisors, that this wouldn't just be about False Bay, it was going to be longer term and bigger than this. And if it worked in False Bay, it might work elsewhere on the coastline. But for that, we couldn't have an outraged public who thought, as one of my colleagues pointed out, in Australia, they call BRUVs chum cams. And I thought, oh, that's the last kind of misinterpretation of the context that I need getting out there. So it changed the face of this project sort of irrevocably, and it almost didn't have another option. At the time, there was, of course, means and ways of proactively taking an approach to engaging with the public rather than reactively having to explain the context within which my research was embedded. I'm not particularly good at social media. I don't have a public Facebook profile, very sporadically active on Twitter, barely use Instagram, so my generation may be a bit anomalous. But within that, I was still able to find what I enjoyed and was maybe okay with doing, and that was making films, writing blogs, and giving the good old, traditional, old-fashioned public talk. So trekking from dive centre to dive centre to kayak centre to fishing pub to yacht club, and giving talks around why we were doing this research before we got into the how and the what. And it's the why that connects to the relevance in people's lives. An underwater camera survey in and of itself isn't really meaning much to most people outside of the scientific community. Most people in False Bay don't think like I do. And the second reason really pertains to this picture. And the second reason was around the fact that you need to prime your audience to receive the information that you're eventually going to give. So I found that people weren't ready to trust me if I just came at them with information, if they didn't know who I was and what I was about and what the bigger picture of what this research project was to start with. So this is the Paulsberg no-take zone of the Table Mountain National Park. That is Smitswinkel Bay. Fishing is allowed in that section. That headland there is the start of the Paulsberg zone, and it runs south from here. Those are recreational fishing boats, merrily fishing away. And what's important here is that there's a lot of information around, and not all of it is correct. Someone told someone at some point that the MPAs in False Bay were proclaimed to protect reef fish, but that meant you were still able to fish for pelagics like snook and yellowtail. It doesn't matter what the actual information was. It doesn't matter what I come to fishermen and say about the real legislation. What matters is the story they decided to believe first. And that's what stuck. And coming at them with the context afterwards, I found really, really challenging. And so I found that it's this balancing process of having an academic project nested into the context to a wider audience, and making sure that at the end of this project, which will be hopefully next year, when I present to you the scientific results, when I sort of meet the end of this and start feeding information into academia or policy or wherever it's going to go, the audience has come along with the journey. And I'm not here with new information, and the public of False Bay are here, and suddenly we've got 5 years to make up. So I found that quite a useful thing to learn hasn't always worked at times. It's challenging, it's time consuming, you don't always enjoy it. It opens you to a fair amount of scrutiny and failure. But I thought I'd end with two little things that we've done in the past 6 months at least to kind of share with the wider story and vision around BRUVs and photographic surveys of the seafloor, because I think I started this out thinking people were captivated by it like I was, and you sit around a dinner table with accountants or lawyers and they just don't really find it quite as fascinating. So this is an immersive web feature that we did on reef fish in False Bay, which links to the broader South African story of inshore reef stocks. What is the issue with the fishermen? What is the issue with declining biodiversity? And nests the research within that. So we have an audience who are users of internet. I can communicate largely in English. Makes it a lot easier being in a largely urbanized context like False Bay. Obviously, moving into the northern regions, being able to speak other languages is going to come in handy. But that has been quite successful. And then the images that you've seen throughout this presentation were part of an assignment that we then made a public free exhibition along the Muizenberg St. James Walkway, which has been up for a year and a half and will run for another 6 months there. So any foot traffic coming along is suddenly looking at fish as something more than what pitches up on your plate with a side of tartar sauce. So I think it's been a bit of a learning curve around how you address coming from a university where obviously academia, I'd worked in Stilbaai and Tsitsikamma before this, where moving into a system and doing research as per normal was perfectly acceptable, and suddenly coming into a system where people hold you accountable, people want to know what's going on, they're actively engaged, and having to rise to meet that challenge has been exciting and challenging. And I want to acknowledge the Save Our Seas Foundation and the Rapid Foundation in closing for supporting this project, and my research advisors, Colin Atwood, Anthony Bernard and Albrecht Gutz, for supporting a kind of insane vision at some point, and just giving me the freedom to run with this. And I'm going to close with a funny little note for a fish nerd. So this is really nothing to do with the science behind this, but I think it links quite nicely to communication. I don't know how many of you work on more charismatic species. Certainly there have been talks on elephants and lions, and I know from attending many marine conferences it's much easier to sell a whale shark to an audience than Pachymetopon blocki, the humble Cape sea bream. But this photograph that I used at the beginning is hanging in the hallowed walls of the Natural History Museum in London as part of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year Awards. I didn't take it. Joris van Alphen is a photographer, a friend who works with Nat Geo, and he's been working with us at Save Our Seas, and he took this photograph, and I had to laugh and think, quite chuffed, that one of the sort of most humble symbols of the False Bay region, something that we see being sold on the side of the road, kind of dried on the corner, heading out to Capricorn Park, has made it finally to an international audience. And maybe it's not just whale sharks and bull sharks and tiger sharks that can captivate an audience outside of ours. Thank you very much.